This is a Geological Society of America book, but they thoroughly studied this core from the lake. So Jack Barnett, he approached us and said, I'd like to see a condensed version of this that would be more understandable to the layperson rather than a collection of scientific articles. Bear Lake, it's special in that it's ancient. I guess you could say most lakes are ephemeral. So they don't last very long. I mean, they fill in with sediment relatively quickly. You know, over the decades and centuries, reservoirs just fill in with sediment. But they've estimated based on fault movement and displacement of the lake bottom from earthquakes that the lake could be millions of years old. Bear Lake has more endemic fish than any other lakes in the U.S. and Canada, with the exception of the Great Lakes. Additionally, there's things like the biology. Having endemic fish in the lake, those kinds of things take time for fish to change into new species evolutionarily. It can often take quite a bit of time. So we could mark the beginning of Bear Lake perhaps as early as when basin and range extension began. So it could be upwards of 10 to 15 million years old. If this basin was created at that time and a lake formed in it, we could be looking at over 10 million years of age. Oh, yeah, that was a good question. Yeah, as I was saying earlier, yeah, lakes don't have much of a lifespan because of filling in from sediments, but Bear Lake being continually renewed, like other tectonic lakes of the world, these can stretch into the millions of years. If I had to guess, I would say Bear Lake is certainly in the top 50 in the world as far as age of lakes. Yeah, the maximum given depth is 208 feet. I've never seen it, of course. These are from sonar or soundings of the lake. So no, I believe it has a bottom. Lake Tahoe, which I brought up earlier, it's over 1,000 feet deep and roughly twice the size of Bear Lake. And its bottom's been found as well, at least from instrumentation. Oftentimes these monsters are plesiosaurs. I'd say 75% of the lake monsters in the U.S. are kind of plesiosaur-like, but Bear Lake's never had a connection to the ocean. Having said that, there might be some discoveries in Bear Lake in the future. Scientists often point to the coelacanth, which you may have heard about before, but this was a fish that was believed extinct for 66 million years. It was in the fossil record, and then in 1938 they pulled one out of the Indian Ocean. It's a lobe-finned fish, very primitive looking fish. So there's always these surprises, but I think the larger the creature, the smaller the water body, the more implausible it is to find something new. Yeah, I'm not a scuba diver, but that whole area, the Bear River Range, there's limestone on the eastern side of the lake as well. It's what they call karst topography, and it's riddled with underground plumbing, springs, sinkholes, and this is because of the nature of limestone and dolostone. It dissolves easily in acid. So I've actually brought kind of a representation of that here. Yeah. So we have, this is the main ingredient in limestone, and it's a very common mineral. It's calcite. It's most of what we drink in fresh water. It's usually the major dissolved mineral. This is what forms that white crusty stuff on your faucet over time. But It's clear in its pure form like that, but here's an example of tufa, and there are these tufa mounds all over Bear Lake, and they're kind of biologically driven calcium carbonate deposits. So through photosynthesis and bacterial action, they cause the calcium carbonate in the water to precipitate out and make these rocks. But this is why we have so many caves in limestone. Is rainwater is slightly acidic, so its pH is a point or two below neutral. So if I put this hydrochloric acid on it, you can see it really dissolves rapidly. So over time, this limestone becomes riddled, almost like Swiss cheese, these caves and sinkholes and springs. In fact, we believe that during times when the Bear Lake is cut off from the Bear River, that these springs sustain the lake. The lake doesn't dry up, even though it has a very small catchment area. It's at high enough elevation, it has enough spring water coming in that it maintains itself as a lake. So the topography underneath, I think it would likely have, it has these tufa structures, it has topography, and no doubt there would be karst-like topography like caves offshore of Bear Lake. During the summer, you can see Bear Lake heats up to about 64 degrees. I think the record temperature of Bear Lake was 73 degrees. It usually averages about 69, the hottest months at the top. So this water is lighter, and it produces, this warmer water produces a cap over the lake with colder, denser water at the bottom. And this effectively cuts off the bottom from circulation with the rest of the lake. Biological organisms at the bottom of the lake use up the oxygen, and it becomes an anoxic environment. During the winter, the surface cools, and then when it cools down to close to the maximum density of water, water's peculiar in that it gets denser till about 39 degrees before starting to expand as it nears freezing. So it gets close to that temperature, and that causes the lake to be top heavy, so to speak. And this water wants to go down, and warmer water from below wants to go up, and the whole lake mixes, which could take a day or two, maybe a little longer. And when that happens, oftentimes you'll smell that rotten egg smell, which is the hydrogen sulfide that was produced by bacteria at depth when it was an anoxic environment over the summer. Yeah, that would happen in most temperate lakes. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Most lakes are shallower than Bear Lake, so it's may not be as dramatic. But even fishermen talk about bad fishing conditions or lake stink when lakes turn over in the spring and fall.
Okay, so it's
That's a good question. Hydrogen during turnover, all this hydrogen sulfide gas is released. Not enough to affect people's health, but you can certainly smell it, and it's a denser gas, so it would accumulate along the surface of the lake. I imagine it's possible there could be some kind of optical effects to that. Nothing I've ever heard of, but when you have light going through a less dense air and into denser gases, and then of course the water itself, you're going to get refraction of light occurring.
Okay, like what?
Oh, during turnover? Yeah. Is there discoloration of the... Yeah, sometimes it increases the turbidity of the water, so you can get some fine sediment suspended. Okay, so when Bear Lake turns over in the late fall, early winter, all that hydrogen sulfide gas is brought up and released to the air. And this gas is heavier than the air itself, and the mixing of the lake can cause some suspension of sediments, perhaps in pockets at first, and then mixing completely in the lake over time, and before eventually settling back down. No, I don't believe it would cause any waves. Maybe upwelling of water itself. So when water upwells, you could have places where water is ascending and descending. Water that is welling up tends to look very clear, and water that is descending, you can have a rough texture to the water. So that would make the lake spotty in appearance. This is a good example of Bear Lake. You can kind of see these light and dark colored layers, and that's recording time. Each one of these light layers is the spring runoff, and every dark layer is the biologically productive summer season. So we're seeing a lot of organic material accumulate during the summer. So light band, dark band, it's kind of like rings of a tree. You can count how many years are in these. And of course you can analyze these in different ways to get a wealth of data from these particular time periods. But if these were varves, is what they call them, these annual cycles, then they represent, a few inches of core represent a huge amount of time. That's a good question. So like this one, for example, is showing some kind of strange event in the lake. So where we may have these consistently fine layers, we see all of a sudden very heavy deposits. They're actually distorting the layers beneath them. We call this soft sediment deformation here. And they're larger particles. It could be something like a storm event or an earthquake that caused a lot of landslide material to go into the lake. But generally this is deep water, and it's largely unaffected except for this layer here over a long period of time. So I don't know exactly what caused that, but it's a big disruption in the record. So every time there's an earthquake, say along the eastern Bear Lake fault area, the valley drops. It drops more towards the east because over the past 15,000 years there's been a few displacements along the eastern Bear Lake fault. So every time there's an earthquake, the valley drops a few feet and the mountains pop up a little. So this is what keeps Bear Lake continually renewed as a lake. Yeah, I've heard the same thing. That there was something I read that where there was a tunnel from Bear Lake to Loch Ness. So across the North American continent, across the Atlantic Basin, yeah, and then popping up in Scotland. At least I think that's where Loch Ness is. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly caves, but nothing I could imagine would extend very far, let alone to any nearby lakes, which I can't think of any lakes that are nearby of that size. Yeah, the tunnels, it's not what we would expect. Yeah. The legend, I believe, is Shoshone of Bear Lake. And, the first Europeans to see it were American and European trappers in the early part of the 1800s. It was Donald Fats Mackenzie who is credited with naming it Black Bear Lake before the black was dropped and it just went to Bear Lake. And
was that because he saw black bears around?
I imagine he did. Yeah, I imagine he did see a black bear. And then, about 8 years later, they began having the Mountain Man Rendezvous at the lake. I've thought about this legend, and I think I have a feeling that the Shoshone legend is because, it's to keep, the most important thing is making sure the next generation survives. And I have a feeling that this legend began to keep children out of the water.